The locals in the logging town of Oak Haven, Oregon had a name for it: the Resin House. They didn't talk about it to tourists, and they certainly didn't put it on any trail maps. It was just a story meant to keep teenagers from wandering too far into the deep, suffocating expanse of the Pacific Northwest pine forests. But Mark wasn't a local. He was an urban explorer from Chicago with a popular YouTube channel, a heavy DSLR camera, and a hunger for places the world had forgotten. The rumor of a house that had stood abandoned since the 1920s, a house that supposedly changed its layout when no one was looking, was too good a clickbait title to pass up. It took him 3 hours of hiking off trail. Guided only by a set of coordinates, he'd bought off a dark web forum for $50. The temperature had dropped 10 degrees the deeper he went, the air growing thick with the smell of wet earth, pine needles, and something else, something like old copper. When he finally saw it, the breath hitched in his throat. The architecture of madness. The house sat in a dead clearing where no trees grew. It was a sprawling Victorian-style monstrosity built of dark, rotting wood that seemed to drink the meager afternoon light. It had no right being out here, miles from the nearest paved road. Mark unclipped his flashlight and pushed through the overgrown brush. The porch groaned a high, agonizing pitch under his boots. The front door was already ajar, hanging off a single rusted hinge. He hit record on his chest-mounted GoPro and pushed his way inside. "All right, guys, I'm in," Mark whispered, his voice sounding entirely too loud in the dead silence. "The air in here is freezing. I can see my breath." He shined his flashlight around the entryway. Faded, peeling wallpaper patterned with dead roses clung to the walls. The floorboards were coated in a thick layer of dust. But something felt immediately wrong. Mark was an architecture buff. It was part of his brand. He knew how houses were supposed to be built. But as he panned his light down the main hallway, the geometry made his eyes ache. To his left was a grand staircase, but it didn't lead to a second floor. It went up about 10 steps and terminated violently into a flat, blank ceiling. To his right, a doorway opened into what should have been a parlor, but the room was perfectly circular with no windows. He raised his camera and snapped a photo of the dead-end staircase. The flash briefly illuminated the oppressive darkness, freezing the dust motes in the air. He looked down at the digital preview screen on his camera. He frowned. In the photo, the stairs didn't end at the ceiling. In the photo, there was a pale, barefoot woman standing on the top step, her back to him, her head pressed against the plaster. Mark's heart hammered against his ribs. He immediately ripped his gaze from the screen to the actual staircase. It was empty. The dust on the steps was completely undisturbed. "Just a glitch," he muttered to himself, his rational mind scrambling for a lifeline. Lens flare, pareidolia. He deleted the photo. But the uneasy feeling settled deep in his gut, heavy as a stone. The shifting walls Mark decided to press on, moving past the bizarre staircase and down the main hall. He needed at least 20 minutes of good footage to make the trek worth it. He stepped into what looked like a dining room. A long, rotted oak table sat in the center. Mark walked around it, running a gloved hand over the wood. When he turned back to leave the way he came, he froze. The doorway he had just walked through was gone. In its place was a solid wall covered in that same peeling rose wallpaper. Mark let out a shaky breath, a nervous laugh escaping his lips. "Okay, very funny. I got turned around. It's dark. He swept his flashlight around the room. The strobe light descent. Mark sprinted down the narrow hall, his broad shoulders scraping against the encroaching walls. He burst through a doorway at the far end, just as the hallway behind him collapsed with a deafening crack of splintering timber. He stumbled into a massive, cavernous room. The air here was suffocatingly hot, smelling strongly of raw sap and decay. His flashlight flickered, the beam dying down to a dim, sickly yellow before clicking off entirely. "No, no, no," Mark chanted, smacking the flashlight against his palm. Nothing. Total suffocating darkness. Thwack. Creak. Thwack. The sound was louder now. It was coming from all around him. Desperate, Mark raised his camera. He couldn't see anything through the viewfinder, but he knew the flash worked. He pressed the shutter. Flash. For a fraction of a second, the room was bathed in blinding white light. Mark saw a massive, vaulted ceiling supported by thick wooden pillars. But they weren't just pillars. They were human figures, stretched and elongated, their screaming faces carved into the wood, their limbs contorted to hold up the beams. Darkness crashed back down. Mark backed away, his chest heaving, tears of pure terror stinging his eyes. He aimed the camera slightly to the right. The light exploded again. 10 feet away, one of the wooden figures was detached from the pillar. It wasn't carved. It was a man, his skin hardened into bark, his eyes wide and petrified, his mouth locked in a silent scream. And he was closer than he had been a second ago. Darkness. Mark whimpered, stumbling backward. He hit a wall, his hands scrambling blindly over the wood, searching for a seam, a door, a window. Anything. The wood beneath his fingers felt warm. It felt fleshy. Thwack. Creak. Thwack. The sound wasn't a hammer. It was the sound of bones breaking and reforming, of joints snapping to fit the architecture of the house. He aimed the camera straight ahead. His finger trembled on the button. Flash. The 3 of the bark-covered figures were standing directly in front of him. Their faces were hollow, their fingers grown into long, sharp splinters. Behind them, Mark could see the barefoot woman from the staircase. Her neck was bent at a broken 90-degree angle, but she was smiling. Darkness returned, heavier than before. Mark dropped the camera. The loud clatter echoed through the cavernous room, quickly swallowed by the rhythmic, agonizing groans of the shifting wood. He felt a sharp, piercing pain in his ankle. A floorboard had curled upward, wrapping around his leg like a wooden serpent, driving splinters deep into his flesh. He screamed, dropping to his knees, clawing frantically at the wood. But it was hardening, fusing with his jeans, piercing his skin. "Please!" he shrieked into the void. A hand made of gnarled roots and dried sap clamped over his mouth. As the house began to slowly pull him into the floor, Mark heard the wood around him groaning, shifting to make room for its newest foundational beam. He tried to thrash, tried to scream, but his skin was already stiffening, drying out, turning a pale, lifeless brown. Somewhere in the darkness, his camera's LED screen stayed illuminated for a few final seconds. It displayed the last photo he took. A perfect shot of the grand parlor, beautifully composed, entirely empty, except for a brand new, terrifyingly lifelike wooden statue leaning against the far wall, a heavy DSLR camera strapped to its chest. Then the battery died, and the resin house settled back into its suffocating silence, waiting for the next curious soul to wander off the trail.